The silken drape of her wedding veil felt less like a blessing and more like a shroud. In Rome, the greatest city on earth, life was built on laws, honor, and duty. But sometimes, duty demanded a price that no law should ever ask a person to pay. The marble floor of the domus was cold beneath her sandals, mirroring the terror that had frozen the blood in her veins. She was 18, a daughter of a noble house, and she was about to become a bride. Yet, the air was thick not with celebration, but with a terrible, silent agreement. Every woman in the room, her mother, her aunts, the stoic priestess, knew what awaited her. They had walked this path before, trading a piece of their soul for the security of a name. They watched Claudia with pity and a grim kind of envy for the ordeal that would finally make her theirs. This is the story of Claudia, whose wedding night was not a celebration of love, but an agonizing, legally mandated ritual. It is the story of a custom so humiliating, so deeply woven into the fabric of Roman marriage law, that the very foundation of the empire was built upon the silence of its daughters. What happens when a contract is signed not with ink, but with a woman's last shred of dignity? The morning air of Rome carried the scent of wood smoke and privilege, but for Claudia, it only smelled of impending doom. She stood before the tall, bronze mirror, an unnaturally perfect statue in her wedding gown, the white tunica recta, tied with the double knot of Hercules, and the flammeum, the heavy, flame-colored veil that covered her head entirely. She was supposed to look like a woman stepping into the light of her future. Instead, she felt like a sacrifice being prepared for the altar. Her mother, Livia, a woman whose face was usually a mask of aristocratic calm, could not hide the trembling in her hands as she adjusted the veil. Livia's eyes, when they met Claudia's in the mirror, were wet, heavy with a grief that had nothing to do with her daughter leaving home. It was a grief born of memory. "Hold your chin up, Cara," Livia whispered, using the affectionate term that only made the moment hurt more. "Remember who you are. Remember what this marriage means." Claudia knew too well. This was not a union of hearts. It was a merger of political influence and financial security. Her father, a respected senator, had secured a match with the powerful house of the Gracchi. The dowry was immense, the political leverage priceless. For centuries, the Fabii family had maintained their prestige, and Claudia's marriage was the cornerstone of their continued success. If this marriage failed, if the contract was invalidated, the disgrace would not merely be a social setback. It would be a catastrophic fall from grace that could ruin their house for generations. The sheer weight of her lineage, the ancestors whose bronze busts lined the atrium, pressed down on her like a physical force. She remembered the fleeting moment of joy a year ago when she had first met Lucius Gracchus. He was a handsome man, aloof and focused on his career in the Forum, but kind in a detached way. He had promised her a secure future, beautiful jewels, and a house where she would be mistress. But neither of them had mentioned the ritual. It was the unwritten, unspoken legal clause of every conferiatio, the highest form of Roman marriage. A custom so old it predated the Republic, yet so legally binding that no Roman magistrate dared to strike it from the books. The elder women were gathering in the courtyard, her aunts, her grandmother, and the matrona of the Gracchi house. Claudia noticed the quick, knowing glances they exchanged, a silent fellowship of women who had all endured the same terrifying transition. Their expressions were not malicious. They were simply informed. They knew the price of their status. They knew that the ceremony in the temple was only the public display. The real contract was sealed later, in the suffocating privacy of the marital chamber. Later, as the priest performed the rites, the sound of the flute music seemed distant and hollow. When Lucius took her hand, his palm was dry and cool, showing no nervousness. He too was an actor in this play. He knew that the real moment of his becoming a husband was tied to Claudia's obedience to a requirement far older and colder than their families. As the sun began to set, casting long, crimson shadows across the forum, Claudia was led away from the feast. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The cheerful noise of the guests faded as the matrona, a severe woman named Elia, took her arm. Elia's grip was surprisingly strong, her eyes steady. "Remember your duty, Claudia," Elia said, her voice a low, steady rumble. "This is the moment that separates the girls who play dress-up from the women who uphold the state. No shame in this room but the shame of refusal. The gods are watching, and the law demands compliance." Claudia could not speak. Her throat was constricted, dry. All the sweet wine she'd been given had failed to dull the sharp edges of her fear. She was being led not to a joyful marital bed, but to a small, windowless room adjacent to the main shrine of the house. Inside, the only light came from a single oil lamp casting distorted, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was heavy, smelling of old incense and something else, a metallic, almost clinical scent. It was in this room that the terrifying, legally mandated humiliation was about to begin, an act of submission to a cold, unseen force that Rome had cleverly disguised as divine tradition. The small room felt like a stone tomb, silent and airless. It was designated not just as a dressing chamber, but as the private Aedes Sacra or sacred annex of the household shrine. This was crucial. By linking the ritual directly to the family's protected deities, the Romans elevated the invasive practice from a mere tradition to a divine and legally enforceable requirement under ius sacrum, sacred law. Elia, the matrona, closed the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing ominously. She was joined by two older priestesses from the Gracchi house, women whose faces were etched with years of observing and enforcing this silent contract. Their movements were methodical, devoid of emotion, like attending physicians rather than celebratory wedding guests. This clinical approach only amplified Claudia's sense of dread. "Remove the flamium, Claudia," Elia commanded, her voice softened slightly, but still entirely firm. "And the knots." Claudia's fingers fumbled with the complex knot of Hercules tied around her waist, the symbol of a married woman's bondage, meant to be undone only by the husband later. But the priestesses had already stepped forward, their hands quick and practiced. The knot was cut cleanly, the long, heavy wool of the tunica recta falling to her feet. She was now dressed only in a thin linen undertunic. The room felt suddenly colder. One of the priestesses presented a small, intricately carved statue. It was not Jupiter, the king of the gods, nor Juno, the goddess of marriage, but a lesser, more specialized deity. Mutunus Tutunus, a god traditionally associated with fertility and the protection of the marital threshold. But in the secrecy of this room, Claudia knew the deity represented something far more specific and terrifying: the enforcement of a woman's complete, irreversible submission to the marital state, enforced through a physical act. The law demands a public vow of submission and a private demonstration of absolute obedience. Elia recited, her voice a monotone, as if reading from an ancient scroll. "You must demonstrate your readiness to accept the obligations of the matrona, the duties of the wife, and the requirements of the Gracchi house, without protest or shame. The god is the witness. The god is the enforcer." Claudia felt dizzy. The tears she had been holding back finally broke free, tracing hot, helpless paths through the powder on her cheeks. "Why?" she choked out, the single word sounding tiny and foolish in the sterile room. "Why must it be this way?" Elia paused, her expression momentarily complex. "Because, child," she said almost gently, "a contract of marriage in Rome is a transfer of property and loyalty. Before the man can claim you, the state, represented by the divinity, must ensure that you are fully broken from your father's house and totally malleable to your husband's. Your compliance in this act proves that you will obey, even when the command is humiliating, even when it is repulsive. It is the ultimate guarantee of your loyalty to the paterfamilias. The revelation that this invasive ritual was legally mandated, not merely a cruel whim of tradition, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. A tradition could be ignored, a law could not. The priestess holding the small statue moved closer. The light from the oil lamp flickered across the carvings, making the figure seem alive, mocking. Claudia tried to step back, but the Matrona's strong arm was instantly around her, holding her steady. "The refusal is worse than the act, Claudia," Elia hissed, her breath warm against Claudia's ear. "Refusal is betrayal. It voids the conferiatio instantly. Your dowry is lost. Your father is disgraced. The Gracchi will demand compensation that will bankrupt your family and drag their name through the mud of the forum. You will be branded infamous, shamed, and relegated to a life worse than a slave's. For your family, for your name, you will obey." The severity of the consequences was a weapon far sharper than any blade. Cut through her resistance, leaving her paralyzed. She realized with chilling clarity that she was not just protecting herself, but protecting the entire foundation of her family's world. Her personal humiliation was the price of their survival. The priestess began to speak the ancient Latin incantation, a low, rhythmic chant that consecrated the small statue and the chamber itself. Claudia shut her eyes, bracing herself, wishing she could disappear, wishing the great city of Rome would simply forget her in this moment. But the ritual, ugly and unyielding, had begun. She was no longer Claudia, daughter of the Fabii. She was a vessel, fulfilling a terrifying clause in the most sacred contract of Roman law. The moment passed with agonizing slowness, yet also with a brutal speed. For Claudia, time shattered. The entire ritual, clinical and detached as it was performed by the priestesses, felt like a deliberate extraction of her self-worth. It was the moment she understood that her body was not her own, but a necessary instrument of her family's political and social survival. When it was over, Claudia stood trembling, her shoulders slumped, trying desperately to recall what it felt like to be a person before entering that room. The linen tunic felt sticky and alien. The Matrona, Elia, gave a curt nod to the priestesses, who immediately set about removing all traces of the ceremony, wiping down the surfaces and covering the statue. The transition back to the wedding night atmosphere was jarringly swift. "It is done," Elia stated, her voice returning to its normal, formal tone. She picked up the discarded flammeum and draped it over Claudia's head again. The heavy, burning color now felt like a brand. "The contract is sealed under ius sacrum. Your marriage is unbreakable. You upheld your duty, Claudia. Your father's house is safe. The Gracchi are satisfied." Satisfied. The word tasted like dust and shame in Claudia's mouth. She wanted to scream, to weep, to tell everyone what the foundation of their great society truly was. But the look in Elia's eyes, cold, uncompromising, and utterly knowing, stopped her. "Listen closely," Elia continued, leaning in. "This is the most important part of your new life. You will never speak of this chamber. You will never speak of the god, nor the act required. Not to your husband, not to your children, and especially not to any outsider, Greek, barbarian, or commoner. If this ritual, which is the very keystone of the Matrona's loyalty, were ever revealed in detail, it would shatter the honor of every great house in Rome." Elia's words were not a threat. They were a chilling description of reality. The Roman ideal of the virtuous wife, pure, devoted, and dignified, rested on a foundation of absolute, terrified silence about this one night. The prestige, the power, and the sanctity of their laws depended on the women of Rome keeping this secret buried deep within themselves. You are now a keeper of the secret, Claudia. This is your power and your curse. Elia finished, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Use your silence to protect your family, and you will be respected. Break it, and you will be destroyed, and you will take every woman who endured this with you. Claudia finally found her voice, though it was only a raspy whisper. Did you go through this, Matrona? Elia's severe face didn't move, but a flicker of something ancient and weary passed through her eyes. I am a Matrona of Rome. I have 2 sons, a daughter, and a husband who has served 3 terms as consul. I have done my duty. It was not an affirmation of pride, but a statement of sacrifice. She then guided Claudia out of the small room and into the main hall, where the remaining wedding guests were still feasting. The abrupt change in atmosphere was dizzying. Laughter, music, the smell of roasted meats and wine. It was a world away from the cold, clinical chamber she had just left. Her mother, Livia, rushed forward, her face a mixture of relief and carefully masked sorrow. Livia hugged her tightly, almost fiercely. Go to your husband now, my lioness, Livia murmured into her ear, using the childhood nickname. The hardest part is over. Now you build your life. Claudia looked across the room. Lucius Gracchus stood waiting, accepting congratulations from his peers. He looked confident, successful, completely untouched by the legal drama that had just played out in the dark corner of his house. He smiled when he saw her, the smile of a man who had acquired a valuable and compliant asset. When she finally stood before him, Lucius raised her veil, the action a public declaration of his possession. His eyes were polite, but distant. He saw a bride, the Fabii's dowry, and a path to higher office. He did not see the terrified girl whose spirit had been legally broken just an hour before. He took her hand and led her towards the thalamus, the marriage chamber, the place where the private part of the contract would now be completed. But for Claudia, the true, terrifying wedding night was already over. It had happened in the silent, cold presence of a forgotten god, and she was now bound by a seal far stronger than any law, the seal of silence. The first few weeks of marriage were a peculiar blend of luxury and profound isolation. Claudia was now the mistress of a magnificent domus on the Palatine Hill. She commanded a small army of slaves, oversaw elaborate banquets, and wore jewels that glittered with her new status. She had everything a Roman woman was supposed to desire, yet she felt like a ghost haunting a lavish tomb. Lucius was an absent husband, which, paradoxically, was the only mercy she received. His life revolved around the forum, the Senate, and military affairs. He treated Claudia with the formal respect due to the wife of a man of his standing. He ensured her comfort, managed the finances meticulously, and presented her publicly as a perfect reflection of his ambition. But their interactions were shallow, transactional, and entirely devoid of emotional connection. The ritual in the sacred annex had permanently altered the landscape of their relationship. While Lucius had not been present for the clinical act of submission, he knew it had occurred. The conferratio could not be valid without it. His polite distance was perhaps a product of his own discomfort with the reality of the legal right, or perhaps simply the indifference of a man focused entirely on power. For Claudia, every polite exchange was a lie. How could she love or even respect a man whose possession of her was rooted in a humiliation he took for granted? She found herself avoiding the central atrium where the family shrine was located, especially the small, inconspicuous door that led to the annex. That door was her private monster, a constant reminder of the cost of her life. The other Matronas of the neighborhood, the women who were now her peers, observed her closely. They praised her beautiful gowns, complimented her skillful management of the household, and offered advice on everything from slave discipline to political maneuvering. They never spoke about the wedding night. It was the unwritten rule, the elephant in every room of high Roman society. Yet, Claudia could see the shared history in their eyes, a deep, weary understanding. One afternoon, while hosting a traditional gathering, Claudia sat with Cornelia, a woman 10 years her senior, known for her sharp mind and powerful influence over her senator husband. Cornelia was discussing the upcoming festivals, but her gaze lingered on Claudia. "You are quiet, child," Cornelia said softly, leaning closer as the slaves poured wine. "The first year of marriage is difficult. So much changes. Your skin is too tight for your robes. You still wear the worries of your father's house, even though you are now under the protection of the Gracchi." Claudia looked down at her hands, twisting the heavy gold rings. "I find that the promises of my new life are heavier than the comforts," she admitted vaguely. Cornelia gave a faint, knowing smile that was unsettling. "Ah, yes, the promise of the Matrona is heavy indeed. It is a promise made in private and upheld in public. But remember this, Claudia. Your silence is now your most valuable asset. It is what makes you powerful. Every man in Rome fears the truth carried by his wife." This conversation startled Claudia. It was the closest anyone had come to acknowledging the secret. Cornelia wasn't offering sympathy. She was offering a grim kind of empowerment. The shared trauma, hidden behind silk and smiles, bound these women together in a formidable, though voiceless, league. They were the keepers of the empire's greatest hypocrisy. The isolation was crushing. Claudia yearned for the easy camaraderie of her girlhood friends, but she knew she could never confide in them. They were either unmarried and blissfully unaware, or married and equally bound by the oath of silence. She had traded genuine connection for status, and the cost was her soul. Her greatest fear became the thought of bearing children. She knew that if she had a daughter, she would one day have to prepare that girl for the same ritual, for the same cold room, for the same betrayal. The thought was a physical pain, a terrible cycle of legal humiliation that she now had the power and the chilling obligation to perpetuate. The velvet cage of her marriage was comfortable, prestigious, and absolutely inescapable. Her duty was done, but her suffering had just begun. 2 years passed. Claudia's life settled into the rhythm of a high-status Roman Matrona. She had mastered the art of appearing serene, managing the household finances, and hosting dignitaries with effortless grace. She was lauded in society as the perfect wife, but inside, the memory of the ritual was a piece of ice lodged near her heart, growing colder and sharper with time. She found a subtle form of resistance in the hidden corners of her mind. She became obsessed with ancient texts, searching the family library for any mention of the deity Mutunus Tutunus, hoping to find a flaw in the legal custom, a loophole in the ancient law that might explain or even invalidate the requirement. What she found was both disheartening and galvanizing. The ritual was not a fleeting tradition. It was foundational. The very first laws governing Roman marriage, dating back to the monarchy, treated the wife as being under the hand of her husband, Manus. This ritual was the physical, divine ratification of that legal transfer, a clear, unambiguous act showing that the woman's submission was total and had been witnessed by the state's oldest divine proxies. It wasn't about sex or fertility as the surface mythology suggested. It was purely about legal control and the sanctity of the marital contract. One day, while reviewing old accounts in the dusty records room, she came across a small, unbound parchment tucked away in a scroll detailing the rules of conferiatio from 2 centuries prior. It was a fragment of a letter written in a shaky, educated hand. The burden is too great. The honor we seek is bought with the souls of our daughters. I cannot in good conscience allow my child to stand before that cold God. I will risk the censure. I will face the forum's scorn. Better to be poor and free than to be Matrona and slave to this horror. The letter ended abruptly, torn off right before the signature. Claudia felt a surge of adrenaline, a profound connection with this unknown ancestor. Someone else had seen the horror, and someone else had tried to fight back. The fragment was a whisper of rebellion, a confirmation that her revulsion was not madness, but justified moral outrage. This led Claudia to take a careful, calculated risk. She began seeking out older women who had fallen slightly outside the rigid structure of Roman society. Widows who had refused to remarry, women whose families had suffered disgrace, or those who devoted themselves to less orthodox cults. She searched for anyone who might be willing to speak, however obliquely, about the unspoken. She found Aura, an aged freedwoman who served as a healer and midwife in the poorer district of the city. Aura was privy to the secrets of both the commoners and the elite, attending births and deaths in the Grand Domus and the crowded insulae alike. Claudia arranged a visit under the pretense of seeking advice for a lingering illness. In Aura's small, cluttered room, surrounded by drying herbs and earthen pots, Claudia finally spoke the forbidden truth, albeit cloaked in allegory. Aura, when a great house builds its foundations, Claudia began, carefully watching the old woman's face. Does the structure last if the cornerstone is tainted? If the stone is placed through a sacrifice that is both legal and deeply shameful? Aura didn't flinch. She kept grinding herbs, her eyes fixed on her work. My lady, Rome is built on tainted stones. Every triumph, every law, every great name, it is all paid for by someone's humiliation. The law is a sharp knife. It doesn't care about dignity, only obedience. Claudia pressed on, her voice low and desperate. But what of those who refuse? The law promises ruin. Is there truly no escape? Aura finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp, ancient, and filled with deep sorrow. Refusal is fire, my lady. It burns everything. I have known one, an ancestor of the Fabii, if I recall the whispers correctly, 200 years ago. She tried to protect her daughter. She lost her husband's protection. The dowry was claimed by the state, and the family was stripped of their standing. The daughter was sold into manumission to repay the debts. She chose moral conscience over social survival, and Rome crushed her completely. The law is too strong, my lady. It demands silence because silence is obedience. The story extinguished the spark of rebellion Claudia had found in the fragment. It was a terrifying confirmation. The price of refusal was not just her ruin, but the utter destruction and degradation of her entire family. The velvet cage might be painful, but the alternative was a violent, irreversible descent into poverty and shame. She was trapped, held hostage by the law itself, forced to carry the empire's darkest secret. Her duty was not to fight, but to survive, and in doing so, perpetuate the cycle. Years melted into decades. Claudia became a formidable figure in Roman society, embodying the very ideal she despised. She bore Lucius 2 sons and 1 daughter, all raised with the strict principles of duty and honor. She secured advantageous marriages for her sons and managed her husband's political ascent until he finally achieved the esteemed position of consul. She was the definition of the successful Matrona, the woman who upheld the state through her quiet strength. Yet, every achievement was shadowed by the awareness of the secret. The price of her success was the continuation of the silent horror. The moment she dreaded arrived when her daughter, Valeria, turned 18. Valeria was bright, spirited, and completely oblivious to the terror that awaited her. She was engaged to a promising young senator from the powerful house of the Lepidi. The match was politically crucial, ensuring the Graccai's legacy for another generation. Claudia prepared for this day with a cold, almost surgical detachment. She had tried, in subtle ways, to inoculate Valeria, telling her tales of female strength, of women who sacrificed for their families, focusing always on the duty above the self. But she could never speak the truth. The wedding day was a painful echo of her own. Valeria, radiant in her flammeum, looked happy and hopeful. The feasting and the public ceremony were all a beautiful, well-rehearsed facade. But Claudia knew the reality waited in the shadowed corner of the Lepidi domus. As the sun began to sink, Claudia took Valeria's arm, leading her not to the thalamus for her husband, but toward the dreaded private annex, the Aedes Sacra, where the matrona of the Lepidi house, an imposing, unsmiling woman, was waiting with the priestesses. Valeria's smile faded as they approached the quiet, isolated part of the house. "Mother, why are we not going to the marriage chamber?" she whispered, confused. Claudia stopped, her hand gripping her daughter's arm tightly. This was her final moment to say something, anything to soften the blow. She had dreamt 1,000 times of exposing the secret, of protecting her child, of finally breaking the chain. But the image of her family's utter ruin, of Lucius's disgrace, and the subsequent degradation of her sons, held her captive, a prisoner of the law she had sworn to uphold. She looked into Valeria's innocent eyes, eyes that would soon be stained with the same shame she carried. Claudia's voice was low, strained, a lifetime of suppressed pain compacted into a few rigid sentences. "My lioness," she said, using the same tender nickname her own mother had used. "I brought you up to understand duty. Your marriage is not a dream of poets. It is a contract of the state. Rome demands that before you accept the protection of your husband, you must prove your total and unquestioning obedience to the gods and the laws that protect the marriage." Valeria's brow furrowed. "Obedience? Mother, what is required?" The matrona looked severe. "You will go into that room," Claudia continued, her gaze unwavering, forcing herself to be the instrument of the system she hated. "You will do exactly what the matrona and the priestesses command, without question, without shame, and without protest. It is quick, it is private, and it is the only way your marriage and the future of our family can be legally and divinely sanctioned. You must be silent about this, always. This knowledge is the most sacred and secret duty of the matrona." Valeria was pale now, sensing the gravity, the quiet terror in the air. She didn't understand the mechanism of the shame, but she understood the absolute command in her mother's voice. The strength Claudia had cultivated over decades was now being used as a weapon against her own child. Claudia gave her daughter a final, agonizing embrace. It was an embrace of both love and profound betrayal. "Go now, Valeria. Be strong. Be silent. The Fabii and the Graccai depend on your obedience." She pushed her daughter gently toward the severe matrona of the Lepidi house, and then she stood back, watching the heavy door close on her daughter's future. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the sound of the cycle continuing, unbroken. Claudia, the perfect Roman matrona, was finally forced to acknowledge her true legacy. She had survived the terror only to become its enforcer. She waited outside the silent room, a statue of grief and duty. She was Rome's perfect woman, powerful, silent, and irreversibly broken. The terror of the wedding night had not been erased from history. It was simply buried in the hearts of its most honored wives, passed down from mother to daughter as the ultimate, chilling cost of an empire built on law and hypocrisy.